Court records from Wilkinson County, Georgia, mention 5 plantation overseers who, on October 14, 1839, entered the Ohio River bottomlands. 36 hours later, only one emerged, and for 3 weeks, he was unable to speak coherently. Lost to swamp conditions were the other 4, according to the county coroner's inquest. But witnesses reported that the survivor's hands were covered in scratches forming unusual patterns, and outside the county jail, he repeatedly drew the same symbol in the dirt, a marking that local Indians said represented the hunted becoming the hunter. For over a century, the descendants of those overseers have refused to discuss what happened in those woods, and from the county archives in 1847, the original incident report disappeared. The truth about what occurred when 5 armed men pursued a 15-year-old girl into a wilderness she knew better than her own name has been deliberately buried. But the evidence, scattered across forgotten testimonies, tells a story that should terrify anyone who believes superior numbers guarantee victory. If you're fascinated by dark historical mysteries like this one, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell before we continue with the story of what happened in those Georgia bottomlands. And I'm curious, comment below what state or city you're watching from. Now, let's discover what really happened when 5 men made the fatal mistake of underestimating their prey. The events that followed would reveal something far more disturbing than a simple wilderness tragedy. They would expose how thoroughly knowledge of the land could transform victim into survivor and pursuer into prey. In 1839, Wilkinson County, Georgia, occupied a peculiar position in the state's geography. It was too far from Savannah's coastal aristocracy to attract refined planters, and too close to Creek Indian territories that had only recently been forcibly removed to attract cautious investors. The county's plantations were smaller operations owned by men who had come to Georgia after failing in the Carolinas, desperate to extract profit from land that fought cultivation at every turn. A reputation was held by the Ohoopee River bottomlands that bordered the county's eastern edge. Even before the creek removal of 1836, the indigenous population had treated those particular swamps with caution. With seasonal floods, the waterways shifted, creating new channels that could disorient even experienced hunters. In sections, cypress trees grew so dense that sunlight never reached the forest floor, and the constant moisture bred vegetation that could hide a person 3 feet away. In curtains thick enough to obscure entire pathways, Spanish moss hung, and the ground itself was treacherous, solid earth that could become sucking mud within 10 paces. On the western edge of these bottomlands sat the Gresham plantation. It was 400 acres of struggling cotton worked by 37 enslaved people. After a series of bad crop seasons in South Carolina left him bankrupt, Thomas Gresham had purchased the property in 1834. He had mortgaged everything to restart in Georgia, and 5 years later, he still operated at the edge of financial ruin. Half of what neighboring plantations produced was his cotton yield, his land exhausted faster than he could clear new fields, and his labor force was, in his words, unmanageable. An unusually high number for a plantation of his size, 5 overseers, were employed by Gresham, but he insisted it was necessary. His enslaved workers, he claimed, required constant supervision. The truth, whispered among neighboring planters' wives, was that Gresham's overseers were men no other plantation would hire. They had been dismissed for excessive brutality from operations in Alabama and Mississippi, places where brutality was already commonplace. Gresham hired them because they worked cheap and asked no questions. The head overseer was Jacob Yarrow, a man of 42 who had worked plantations since age 15. He was methodical in his cruelty, keeping detailed records of punishments administered and calculating exactly how much suffering a person could endure before productivity declined. Serving as his assistant was his younger brother, Samuel Yarrow, equally systematic but lacking Jacob's restraint. The 3 other overseers, Nathaniel Cruz, William Tyson, and Henry Burke, were younger men who had gravitated to Gresham's plantation because it gave them license to indulge their worst impulses without consequence. Among the enslaved population at Gresham Plantation was a girl named Celia, 15 years old in October 1839. Her mother had been Creek Indian, captured during the conflicts preceding the removal, and subsequently sold into slavery despite questionable legality. Her father had been African, brought to Georgia through the illegal slave trade that continued despite federal prohibition. From her mother, Celia had inherited knowledge of the bottomlands, and from her father, a mechanical aptitude. She could navigate terrain that confused others and fashion tools from materials most people would overlook. The plantation's vegetable gardens were worked by Celia, a position that theoretically kept her closer to the main house, away from the field overseer's constant supervision. But 2 years earlier, Thomas Gresham's wife had died, leaving no one to manage domestic affairs, and as she matured, the overseer's attention had increasingly turned toward Celia. She had learned to move quietly, to anticipate when trouble was coming, to make herself small and unnoticeable. More than most, the creek removal had affected the Gresham plantation. Relationships with nearby creek communities had been maintained by several of the enslaved population, trading knowledge and occasionally food. When the Indians were forced west, these connections severed abruptly. But before dying of fever in 1838, Celia's mother had taught her daughter everything: how to read the forest, identify edible plants, find clean water, recognize animal behavior, and navigate by stars, moss, and tree growth patterns. The difference between life and death was what this knowledge was about to become. With fog so thick it obscured the plantation buildings from each other, October 14, 1839, began. Despite the visibility, the cotton still needed picking, and at dawn as always, the enslaved workers moved into the fields. Between the rows, Celia carried water, a task that kept her visible to multiple workers, a learned survival strategy. Around mid-morning, Samuel Yarrow approached her with instructions to report to the overseer's cabin. The tone was recognized by Celia. She had learned to read the particular way he looked at her. For months, she had been avoiding this moment, but the summons was direct, and immediate consequences would follow a refusal. She walked toward the cabin, but instead of entering, she continued walking past the building toward the eastern property line, toward the bottomlands. Behind her, she heard Samuel's shout of surprise, then anger. She didn't run yet. Running would signal guilt, would give them justification. With purpose, she walked, as though following instructions. But when Samuel's shouts brought the other overseers, when she heard multiple voices and the particular excitement that came into men's voices when they sensed pursuit, she ran. Abruptly, the bottomlands began, solid ground transitioning to swamp with little warning. At full speed, Celia hit the tree line, her bare feet finding purchase on ground that would have tripped someone wearing boots. Behind her, the voices multiplied. Not just Samuel now, but Jacob's authoritative commands and the younger overseer's eager responses. As the 5 overseers grabbed rifles and rope, Thomas Gresham himself appeared. A later testimony from a field worker reported hearing Gresham tell them to bring her back unspoiled because damaged property couldn't be sold and he needed every asset he could liquidate. Overheard by the same witness, Jacob Yarrow's response was less concerned with property value. 15 minutes behind Celia, the 5 men entered the forest. They carried rifles, knives, rope, and the absolute confidence that comes from never having experienced consequences. Before, they had tracked runaways, always successfully. Within hours, a 15-year-old girl alone in the wilderness would be found, terrified and compliant. The Ojai bottomlands were dangerous, yes, but not to armed men familiar with forest pursuit. What they didn't know was that Celia had been preparing for this moment since her mother's death. During water runs, she had been carrying supplies into the forest. A knife stolen from the kitchen was hidden in rotting logs. A tinder box wrapped in oilcloth was buried in a hollow tree. Dried meat, taken piece by piece from the smokehouse, was cached in waterproof pouches her mother had taught her to make from animal bladders. Every pathway her mother had shown her, every seasonal route through the swamps, every high-ground island invisible to outsiders, she had memorized them. A terrified child was what the 5 men expected to find. Something entirely different was what they would discover. The first day of pursuit seemed to confirm the overseer's expectations. Easily, they found Celia's trail, broken branches, disturbed vegetation, the occasional footprint in mud. With satisfaction, Jacob Yarrow, an experienced tracker, pointed out each sign. Deeper into the bottomlands led the trail, away from neighboring plantations where she might have sought help, into wilderness that would exhaust and disorient her. Methodically, they followed, pacing themselves, expecting to find her collapsed from exhaustion before nightfall. About what would happen when they caught her, the younger overseers joked, each comment crueler than the last. Jacob let them talk, knowing that anticipation made men careless, but also knowing this pursuit would end like all the others, with submission and punishment and a return to proper order. But as afternoon stretched toward evening, the trail began to behave strangely. It seemed to double back on itself, crossing previous paths in ways that suggested confusion. They would find clear signs of passage, then nothing for stretches, then signs again in unexpected locations. She was lost, wandering randomly, Samuel Yarrow suggested. But with growing unease, Jacob studied the patterns. The randomness seemed almost deliberate, designed to keep them moving in circles. When darkness came, they made camp on a relatively dry hummock, lighting a fire that illuminated the hanging moss like curtains around them. They took turns on watch, 2 men sleeping while 3 stayed alert. But without incident, the night passed. The forest around them was loud with animal sounds, frogs and insects, and occasional larger creatures moving through underbrush, but no sign of the girl. Something that disturbed even Jacob's confidence was revealed by dawn. During the night, their packs had been opened, not violently torn or scattered, but carefully searched. Food was missing, not all of it, but selected items: dried beef, hardtack, a canteen. William Tyson insisted he'd been awake, watching, but had seen nothing. Motionless, the moss curtains had hung. Steadily, the fire had burned, yet without detection, someone had moved among their supplies. With the first flickers of uncertainty, the 5 men looked at each other. A terrified runaway didn't steal food with surgical precision from armed men. Planning, confidence, and most disturbing of all, complete comfort moving through darkness that disoriented them even with firelight, this behavior suggested. The decision to continue pursuit was made by Jacob. But the dynamic had shifted. A fleeing child was what they weren't hunting anymore. They were following something that understood the forest better than they did. Something that had deliberately led them deep into unfamiliar territory, something that had approached their camp with enough stealth to take supplies while they watched. That morning, the trail resumed, clearer now, almost as though she wanted them to follow. Turning back was suggested by Samuel, but Jacob pointed out the practical problem. They had traveled far enough into the bottomlands that returning meant admitting failure to Gresham, meant acknowledging they had been outmaneuvered by a teenage girl. On dominance, on never showing weakness, their reputations as overseers depended. They had to find her. By midday of the second day, something that made him stop walking was noticed by Nathaniel Cruz. The trees around them bore markings, not random natural damage, but deliberate scratches in patterns. Creek symbols, he thought, though he couldn't read them. At regular intervals, the marks appeared on trees, forming a trail that paralleled the direction they'd been moving. The marks were examined by Jacob, and something cold settled in his stomach. These weren't old carvings from displaced Indians. The sap was fresh, made recently. Their route was being marked by her, creating a visible record of where they'd traveled, as though documenting their path for some future purpose. The pursuit had inverted. They thought they were hunting her, but she was tracking them, learning their patterns, watching from concealment while they crashed through underbrush. Silently, she navigated. That afternoon, the first cache was found by them. Hidden in a hollow cypress was a collection of items that made no sense: their rope, cut into measured lengths, empty cartridge casings from their rifles, though no one remembered firing, a piece of cloth torn from Henry Burke's shirt, though he insisted his clothes were intact. Deliberately, almost ritually, the items were arranged, and above them, scratched into the tree's interior, was another symbol. Immediately, William Tyson wanted to leave. There was something wrong about the arrangement, something that suggested not panic but purpose. They were dealing with someone who was collecting from them, documenting them, and the implications were deeply unsettling. But Jacob's pride wouldn't allow retreat. Defeated by a girl they had been sent to retrieve, 5 armed overseers couldn't return to the plantation. Their authority would be destroyed by the humiliation, make them jokes among the enslaved population. They would find her, he insisted, and severe enough to discourage future resistance would be the punishment for this defiance. They pressed forward, but cohesion was fracturing. At sounds, the younger overseers started arguing about which direction to travel. Around them, the bottomland seemed to shift. Pathways that appeared solid dissolved into sucking mud. Dry ground they'd crossed earlier was now underwater, and the constant curtains of moss created an environment where visibility extended only a few feet in any direction. That evening they made camp again, this time posting all 5 men as watch. No one was sleeping. Larger than necessary, they built the fire, pushed back the darkness, kept their rifles loaded and ready. Louder now, more deliberate, the night sound seemed. Something was moving through the forest around them, circling their position, staying just beyond firelight. First, Samuel Yarrow broke. Around midnight, suddenly he stood and fired his rifle at movement in the darkness. Through the swamp, the shot echoed, and so completely silence fell it was like the forest was holding its breath. Then the normal sounds resumed, insects, frogs, water moving over cypress roots. But in the morning, they discovered where Samuel's bullet had gone. A tree 30 feet away had been struck by it. And embedded in the bark beside the bullet hole was one of their knives. Deep into the wood, the blade was driven at exactly the height where Samuel had been sitting. From above, from the tree canopy at the exact moment he'd fired blindly into darkness, the angle suggested it had been thrown. The message was clear. Directly above them, she had been. She could have struck any of them but had chosen to respond to Samuel's aggression with a demonstration of precision rather than violence. She was showing them she had opportunities to harm them and was deliberately choosing not to. Yet, the knife and the bullet hole were studied by Jacob, and with crystalline clarity, he understood that they were no longer in control of this situation. A girl they'd considered helpless had maneuvered them into terrain where every advantage they possessed, weapons, numbers, physical strength, meant nothing. She knew where they were at all times, could approach undetected, and was psychologically dismantling them with demonstrations of superiority. The question now wasn't whether they would catch her. The question was whether they would survive to leave the bottomlands at all. The third morning began with a discovery that shattered what remained of their confidence. Henry Burke's rifle was missing. Not taken in the night, he insisted he'd been holding it at dawn, but vanished during the few minutes they'd been breaking camp. One moment it was leaning against a tree. The next it had disappeared. Frantically, they searched, spreading out despite Jacob's orders to stay together, and that's when the forest began to actively work against them. Onto what appeared to be solid ground, William Tyson stepped and plunged waist-deep into mud that sucked at him with surprising strength. While the others struggled to pull him free, Nathaniel Cruz discovered that several trees bore fresh markings, arrows pointing in different directions, as though offering them choices for routes forward. But when they followed one arrow, they found themselves at a creek they'd crossed earlier, somehow circling back. To similar dead ends, the other arrows led, ground that seemed familiar, landmarks they'd passed before. She was herding them, Jacob realized, keeping them moving but controlling their direction, wearing them down physically and mentally. Nearly exhausted were their supplies. Their reserve rations had been the food she'd taken the first night. They had been drinking swamp water, risking illness. A fever had been developed by Nathaniel, shaking despite the humid heat. Badly swelling was William's leg, injured during his plunge into the mud. They were weakening while she remained invisible, untouched, orchestrating their deterioration. That afternoon, singing was heard by them. A woman's voice carrying through the forest from no identifiable direction, singing in a language none of them recognized. Creek words were mixed with something else, a melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Further, the sound disoriented them, made it impossible to determine distances or directions. Finally, Samuel Yarrow snapped. He began screaming into the forest, cursing, promising terrible violence if she didn't show herself immediately. With fear disguised as rage, his voice cracked, and his brother couldn't calm him. With hollow eyes, the other men watched, too exhausted for similar outbursts, understanding that Samuel's threats were meaningless. They had no authority here. The forest belonged to her, and they were intruders being slowly consumed by their own inadequacy. As evening approached, in a clearing they hadn't seen before, they found themselves. a small island of solid ground, surrounded by water on all sides. The ground was scattered with bones, animal remains mostly, but arranged in patterns that might have been natural or might have been deliberate. In the center of the clearing was a structure, a shelter built from branches and moss, clearly inhabited recently. Inside the shelter, they found their missing supplies. Not all of them, but enough to survive: dried meat, the stolen canteen, and Henry Burke's rifle, unloaded, the ammunition scattered around it like decoration. It was an offering and a mockery simultaneously. That she could provide for herself and control their access to resources, that she held their survival in her hands, she was demonstrating. A decision born of desperation was made by Jacob. They would wait here in this clearing, and eventually, she would have to come to them. They had shelter, some supplies, and a defensible position. They couldn't win by pursuing her, but they might survive by staying still. But waiting in one place meant giving her complete initiative, meant sitting exposed while she watched from concealment, and the psychological strain was immediate. A potential threat became every sound. A possible attack became every shadow. In the clearing center, the 5 men sat back to back, rifles pointing outward, waiting for movement that never came in ways they could predict. The attack, when it came, wasn't what they expected, not violence, but escalating psychological warfare that exploited every fear they'd developed over 3 days in the bottomlands. It began at sunset with sounds, footsteps circling their position, moving through water, always just beyond the clearing's edge. The sounds would approach, then retreat, never following predictable patterns. Sometimes the steps moved quickly, as though running. Other times they slowed to a deliberate pace that suggested someone moving with complete confidence through terrain that terrified the 5 men huddled in the clearing center. Then voices joined the footsteps, whispered words in languages they didn't understand, seeming to come from directly behind each man, even though they sat back to back. The words carried different tones, sometimes melodic like singing, other times harsh and guttural. His own name spoken in his mother's voice, though his mother had been dead for 15 years, Nathaniel swore he heard. Someone was reciting scripture, William insisted, twisted verses that sounded almost right but contained subtle blasphemies that made his skin crawl. Order was tried to be maintained by Jacob, reminding them these were tricks, psychological manipulation designed to break their resolve, but with each passing hour, his voice carried less authority, and the other men responded with vacant stares that showed how thoroughly their confidence had eroded. Nathaniel, already feverish, became convinced something was moving beneath the water's surface, circling them like a predator. He began describing creatures he insisted he could see, forms that didn't match any animal he knew, watching from just below the waterline with eyes that reflected their firelight in colors no natural animal produced. He was hallucinating, fever-induced visions, the others told him, but their voices carried uncertainty, and with growing dread, they found themselves watching the water. Rifles were pointed at ripples that might have been wind or might have been something else entirely. The moss curtains hanging from surrounding trees began to move, though there was no breeze. Altogether, they swayed in rhythm, then individually, creating patterns that seemed almost intentional. These movements were watched by Henry Burke with increasing agitation, convinced he could see shapes forming in the hanging vegetation, human silhouettes that appeared and dissolved, always at the edge of his peripheral vision, never quite solid enough to justify firing at, but too consistent to dismiss as imagination. Around midnight, the sounds changed. Now it was laughter. A girl's laughter coming from multiple directions simultaneously, as though she'd multiplied or positioned herself impossibly in several locations at once. The laughter would start to their north, clear and distinct, then stop abruptly. Seconds later, it would resume from the south with the exact same tonal quality, the same rhythm, then east, then west, then from above, as though she was in the tree canopy directly over their heads. Samuel Yarrow broke formation, standing and firing his rifle repeatedly into the darkness, screaming that she was mocking them, that he'd show her what happened to people who defied their bets. Nothing except announcing their ammunition expenditure and creating muzzle flashes that destroyed their night vision temporarily was accomplished by his shots. When the echoes faded and their eyes adjusted again, the laughter resumed, now holding a note of genuine amusement that cut deeper than any insult could have. His brother's arm was grabbed by Jacob, he was pulled back down, hissed at to conserve ammunition. But a wild quality had been taken on by Samuel's eyes, and he kept muttering about respect, about proper order, about teaching lessons. His grip on reality was slipping, Jacob realized, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Degree by degree, they were all slipping into a psychological abyss, where their fundamental assumptions about power and control dissolved completely. Strangely, the fire began to behave. It would flare suddenly, bright enough to illuminate the entire clearing, then die down to embers just as quickly despite having plenty of fuel. During the bright flares, they could see the forest around them in detail, the water, the trees, the hanging moss, but never any sign of their tormentor. During the dim periods, so completely the darkness pressed in that they couldn't see their own hands in front of their faces. That during these darkness cycles, things moved in the clearing was noticed by Henry. Not large movements, but subtle shifts. A pack that had been to his left was now to his right. A rifle leaning against one tree was now against another. Small changes that suggested someone was entering their defended position during the moments they couldn't see, rearranging their possessions, demonstrating complete access to their space and belongings. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, singing was heard again by them, but this time it wasn't distant or directionless. From the shelter in the clearing center, the structure where they'd found their supplies earlier, it came. The voice was clear and close, singing in Creek words they couldn't understand. A melody that carried both sadness and strength. Toward the shelter, all 5 men turned, rifles raised, but without pause, the singing continued. Into the structure they should fire, burn it down, force her into the open, William suggested. But with a harsh whisper, Jacob stopped him. If she was actually in there, if she had somehow approached that close without them detecting her, then she wanted them to know it. Once again, she was showing them that she could reach them whenever she chose, and their weapons meant nothing. Abruptly, the singing stopped, replaced by silence so complete it felt oppressive. For what would come next, they waited, barely breathing. Minutes passed. 5. 10. Nothing happened. Entirely, the normal forest sounds had ceased, as though every creature in the bottomlands was holding its breath, waiting for the same thing the 5 men waited for. Then Jacob's shoulder was touched by something. He spun, rifle raised, finger on the trigger. But there was nothing behind him except his brother, who was facing the opposite direction. Yet clearly he had felt it, a hand pressing down on his shoulder for just a moment. The unmistakable pressure of fingers through his shirt. He hadn't moved, hadn't touched anyone, Samuel insisted, and the wild fear in his brother's eyes convinced Jacob he was telling the truth. Over the next hour, similar contacts were experienced by each man. A touch on the back of the neck, pressure against a leg, something brushing past an arm, always just at the edge of perception, always gone before they could react, always impossible to verify. With each other, they started arguing, each man accusing the others of playing tricks, of trying to frighten companions for cruel amusement. But hollow rang the accusations because they could see each other, could verify that no one was moving enough to create these sensations. Worse than any physical threat could have been was the psychological explanation. She was showing them that even sitting in a tight circle, facing outward with loaded weapons, they couldn't protect themselves from her presence. Like smoke, she moved among them, touching them at will, demonstrating that the barrier between hunter and prey had not just collapsed, but inverted completely. Dawn on the 4th day revealed that during the night she had been in the clearing with them for far longer than those brief touches suggested. Each man's pack had been opened, and inside were gifts, flowers native to the bottomlands, arranged carefully. Swamp hibiscus, pickerel weed, spider lilies, all placed with almost delicate care. But mixed with the flowers were more disturbing items. Locks of hair that matched each man's color and texture, cut recently, not ripped out violently, but trimmed neatly as though with scissors or a very sharp blade. The amount of hair suggested she had been close enough to cut multiple strands from each man, close enough to touch their heads, to work carefully in darkness while they sat awake and supposedly vigilant. Strips of fabric from their clothing were taken without them noticing. From the hem, a piece was missing from Henry's shirt. From the inside of the leg where it wouldn't be immediately visible, a square was cut from Samuel's trousers. Buttons he hadn't noticed were missing from Nathaniel's jacket. And in Jacob's pack, a piece of paper salvaged from their supplies on which someone had drawn 5 figures. Simple stick figures, the kind a child might make, but rendered with enough detail to be identifiable. Characteristics that matched one of the overseers were had by each figure. Taller than the others was Jacob's drawn. Close to his brother was Samuel positioned. With symbols suggesting illness was Nathaniel marked. Over their chests, 4 of the 5 figures were marked with X symbols. Clear, deliberate crosses that needed no interpretation. The 5th figure, the one representing Jacob, bore no mark. It simply stood apart from the others, unfinished, questioning. The message was unmistakable. Close enough to touch them, to take from them, to harm them if she'd chosen, she had been. A choice she hadn't yet made was represented by the 4 marked figures, and a question was the unmarked 5th figure. Who would she allow to survive? The drawing was stared at by Jacob, and something fundamental broke inside him. On dominance, on the certainty that force and authority could control any situation, he had built his entire identity. For 30 years, that belief had proven true. Because they feared him, enslaved people complied. Because they recognized superior strength, other overseers deferred. At every turn, his position was reinforced by the entire social structure of plantation life. But here in this clearing, surrounded by evidence of his complete vulnerability, that certainty crumbled. With someone who feared him, he wasn't dealing. He was dealing with someone who pitied him enough to offer mercy he didn't deserve, and the psychological wound of that realization was deeper than any physical injury could have been. That morning, Nathaniel Cruz didn't wake up. Beyond the point where the body could fight it, his fever had progressed. During the night, his breathing had grown shallow, and sometime before dawn, it simply stopped. For pulse, they checked, found none, and with hollow eyes, sat staring at his body. The first of them to die, killed not by violence, but by illness. Exacerbated by stress, dehydration, and the relentless psychological pressure of 3 days being hunted by prey they couldn't catch. The decision to leave him was made by Jacob. They couldn't carry a dead man through the swamps, and staying meant they would all die eventually. It was brutal calculus, survival arithmetic. Abandoning a companion's body because resources were finite, and sentiment was a luxury they couldn't afford. But like crossing a line felt leaving Nathaniel's corpse. As hunters, as men with power and purpose, they had entered the forest. Now they were abandoning their dead and fleeing like animals. Stripped away was all pretense of authority. At least they should bury him, Samuel insisted. But the obvious was pointed out by Jacob: they had no tools, the ground was too wet, and spending hours digging would only give her more time to orchestrate whatever came next. With what water remained, they left Nathaniel in the clearing, a meaningless gesture toward humanity, and continued moving. But now they were 4, weakened, and to their deterioration, the psychological weight of abandonment was added. The same thing was being thought by each man, though none would voice it aloud: who would be next? Whose body would they leave in some future clearing? Over the next hours, around them, the forest seemed to tighten. The paths grew narrower, the water deeper, the solid ground less frequent. Through passages barely wide enough for their bodies, they moved single file. Like deliberate obstacles, cypress roots grabbed at their legs. With every step, mud sucked at their boots, as though the earth itself wanted to hold them in place. Walking point, Henry Burke kept encountering paths that seemed solid but dissolved into waist-deep water after a few steps. Carefully, he would test the ground, declare it safe, take 3 paces, and plunge into hidden pools. After the 5th time, completely shattered was his confidence, and he refused to continue leading. But at the rear, Jacob insisted someone had to break trail, and even here, even now, rank still meant something. Around midday, William Tyson's injured leg finally gave out. Into water that came to his chest, he collapsed, unable to stand. And when the others tried to lift him, the ground beneath them shifted, destabilizing everyone. To nearly twice its normal size, his leg had swollen. In ways that suggested serious infection, the skin was discolored. He needed medical attention, bed rest, clean water, antibiotics that wouldn't be widely available for another 60 years. What he had was 3 desperate men trying to keep him upright in a swamp that wanted to pull him down. For 10 minutes, maybe 15, they struggled, trying to find footing solid enough to support his weight. But the more they moved, the deeper they sank. The same calculation he had made with Nathaniel was finally made by Jacob. Slowing them down was William, using energy they couldn't spare, and his condition would only worsen. With horror, Henry and Samuel looked at Jacob, understanding what he was suggesting before he voiced it aloud. 2. William understood. He stopped fighting, stopped trying to stand, and at each of them in turn, he looked. No accusation, just resignation, held his expression. Since his leg gave out, he had known this was coming, had felt his companion's desperation growing with each failed attempt to move him. Go, he said quietly. She's watching anyway. Staying just means she takes all of us. In the confusion of trying to find stable ground to continue from, in the desperate scramble to extract themselves from the mud that held them, William Tyson slipped away. Not attacked, not pulled under by anything except gravity and water and his body's inability to fight anymore. They heard him thrashing, calling for help with decreasing volume, and then nothing. With almost casual efficiency, the swamp had claimed him, and none of them had the physical or moral strength to attempt another rescue. 3 now, they were, Jacob, Samuel, and Henry, moving through a nightmare landscape that seemed actively hostile to their presence. Nearly gone was their ammunition. At sounds and shadows, they had wasted shots firing. Exhausted was their food. Contaminated swamp water that would likely make them sick was their water supply. They were lost, unable to retrace their route, unable to determine which direction led to the plantation they had left what felt like years ago, but had only been 4 days. Now, constant markings were borne by the trees around them. Creek symbols they couldn't read but understood were messages. Some seemed to point directions, offering guidance. Others appeared more ominous, warnings perhaps, or simply documentation of their passage. A record was being created by her, they realized, marking this hunt the way hunters marked successful tracking. Except in this case, the prey was creating the record of the hunter's failure. That afternoon, exhausted and delirious, into another clearing they emerged and found Celia waiting for them. On the far side of a small pond, she stood, perfectly visible in afternoon sunlight that filtered through the cypress canopy. No attempt to hide or run was made by her. She simply stood there, solid and real after days of being everywhere and nowhere, finally allowing them to see her clearly. Nothing like the terrified runaway they had expected to catch did she look. Her clothes were muddy but intact, practical garments that allowed free movement. In what looked like charcoal mixed with clay, her face bore patterns drawn, not random marks, but deliberate designs that might have been camouflage or might have been ceremonial. With plant fibers, her hair was pulled back and tied. Barefoot, she was, her feet showing none of the damage theirs had sustained from days walking on roots and through mud. Most striking was her expression. Not fear, not anger, not even triumph, just calm assessment, the look of someone evaluating a situation with complete confidence in their ability to handle whatever developed. In her hands, she held a bow constructed from materials in the forest, the kind of hunting implement her Creek ancestors had used for generations. Perfectly, the wood was bent. Woven plant fiber or sinew, the string appeared to be, and the arrow, narked but not drawn, looked professionally made, with stone tip and feather fletching. From natural materials while staying ahead of 5 armed men, she had built a functional weapon. Behind her, arranged on the ground, were their missing items. Into snares and traps, the rope they had carried was now fashioned. In a neat row, the ammunition she had taken was lined up. Unloaded and disassembled into components was Henry's missing rifle, and their knives were arranged in patterns that suggested she had been studying the weapons, learning their construction and weaknesses. For a long moment, no one moved. At the clearing's edge, the 3 men stood frozen, rifles raised but uncertain, facing this girl who had orchestrated their destruction without ever resorting to direct violence. She had let the forest do the work, had simply guided them into situations where their own mistakes and the environment's dangers combined fatally. First, Jacob Yarrow found his voice. "You've had your fun," he said, trying to inject authority into words that came out cracked. But it ends here. You're coming back with us, and for this, you'll face punishment. Slightly, Celia tilted her head, studying him with the same calm assessment. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, carrying easily across the small pond. Creek influences with the regional dialect of Georgia were blended in her accent, marking her as someone who existed between worlds. Punishment, she said, for running when you intended harm. For surviving when you intended capture. For knowing my mother's land better than you know your own greed. Forward, Samuel Yarrow stepped, raising his rifle more deliberately. You killed Nathaniel and William. That's murder, and you'll hang for it. I killed no one, Celia replied calmly. Your friend died of fever you couldn't treat. The other drowned in water he couldn't escape. I touched neither of them. The forest took them because they didn't belong here. Didn't understand how to move through it safely. Just as it will take you if you don't leave now. His rifle was raised by Jacob, sighted carefully down the barrel, his hands shaking from exhaustion, but his intention clear. After everything, the humiliation, the deaths, the complete dismantling of his authority, here he would end this. One shot and the problem would be solved. They could claim she had attacked them, that it was self-defense, that the other deaths had been her doing. The story would be believed because the alternative, that they had been defeated by a girl who never raised a hand in violence, was too humiliating for anyone to accept. He pulled the trigger. The gun misfired. A mechanical failure caused by 4 days of exposure to swamp water, mud in the barrel, moisture in the powder. The loudest sound in the clearing was the click of the hammer falling on a dead cartridge. In response, Celia drew her bow. The movement fluid and practiced, and released in one smooth motion. The ground 6 inches in front of Jacob's right foot was struck by the arrow, embedding itself in soft earth at an angle that demonstrated absolute precision. Exactly where she had intended, she had aimed, showing that she could have struck him center mass if she had chosen, that his life continued only because she permitted it. Before any of them could react, she had another arrow narked. This one drawn partially, ready to release fully if they moved against her. For men entered these bottomlands, she said, her voice still calm but now carrying an edge that made clear she was done being patient. 2 are dead from their own inability to survive here. 2 more can join them, or 1 can walk out alive and carry a message back to Gresham and anyone else who thinks ownership is stronger than knowledge. At the items arranged behind her, she gestured, their possessions, their weapons, everything they had brought into the forest now under her control. I could have killed you the first night, she continued. Cut throats while you slept, pushed you into deep water. Any of 100 ways this forest offers. I didn't because I wanted you to understand something before you died or left. You don't own the forest. You don't own people who know it better than you. You don't own anything except your ignorance. And that ignorance is what killed your friends. First, Henry Burke broke. The accumulation of 4 days, the psychological warfare, the deaths, the complete inversion of power, had pushed him past his breaking point. Like it burned, he dropped his rifle, turned, and ran, crashing back through the passage they had emerged from, fleeing with the last reserves of his strength. His face was whipped by branches, his feet were caught by roots, waist-high water splashed, and he didn't care. Driven by pure animal terror, he just ran. Hesitated Samuel, looking at his brother, loyalty warring with survival instinct. No emotion now, just exhaustion and the hollow recognition of complete defeat, showed Jacob's face. His choice was made by Samuel. Into this disaster, he had followed his brother, but into death, he wouldn't follow him. After Henry, he turned and ran, abandoning Jacob in the clearing with the girl who had destroyed them all without raising a hand in violence. Alone, Jacob Yarrow stood, facing Celia across the pond, his useless rifle hanging from hands that no longer had the strength to raise it. With perfect clarity, he understood that he had lost everything: authority, reputation, even basic survival advantage. In her domain, he was an intruder. And mercy he didn't deserve was being offered by her. Mercy that would taste like ash for whatever remained of his life. Why? He asked, and his voice sounded like a stranger's. Why let any of us live? Slightly, Celia lowered her bow but kept the arrow narked. Because dead men don't carry messages. Someone needs to tell Gresham what happened here. Someone needs to tell the other overseers. Someone needs to make them understand that running doesn't always mean you're prey and hunting doesn't always mean you're in control. She paused, then added something that would haunt Jacob Yarrow for whatever time remained to him. My mother taught me to read this forest the way you read account books. Every plant, every sound, every shift in wind or water, they all speak if you know how to listen. She taught me because she knew this day might come, because she understood that knowledge is the only power that can't be taken by force. You entered my classroom with guns, expecting weakness. You found strength you didn't know existed because you never bothered to look for it. Toward the passage Henry and Samuel had taken, she gestured. Walk away. Tell your story. Maybe someone will learn something, though I doubt it. Men like you don't learn from losing. You just find new ways to convince yourselves you didn't really lose. Something wanted to be said by Jacob. Wanted to be salvaged with some shred of dignity from this disaster, but there was nothing left to salvage. By dominance and control, he was a man who defined himself, and both had been stripped away so thoroughly he barely recognized himself. His companions, he turned and followed, leaving his rifle behind because it was useless weight now, stumbling through the swamp with no dignity left, just the animal desperation to survive long enough to reach familiar ground. Behind him, one final time, he heard Celia's voice, carrying clearly through the forest. The Bottomlands remember, and I remember. If Gresham sends more men, I'll be here, and next time none walk out. From the Ojai Bottomlands, Henry Burke emerged 36 hours after the three survivors separated in the clearing. On his hands and knees, he crawled out of the tree line, delirious, covered in mud and scratches that formed patterns across his skin like writing in a language no one could read. Torn were his clothes. Gone were his boots. From countless cuts sustained grabbing at roots and branches during his flight, his hands were bleeding. Near the eastern property line around dawn, plantation workers found him, babbling about forests that moved and girls who multiplied and water that consumed. To the overseer's quarters, they carried him, tried to get coherent information from him, but he couldn't form complete sentences. Fragments, he kept repeating, she was everywhere, in the trees, under the water, behind us. She touched us while we watched. The forest listened to her. The forest listened. From the county seat, Thomas Gresham summoned a doctor, a man experienced with fever and delirium, who examined Burke thoroughly and declared him physically intact but mentally shattered. Superficial were the scratches covering his body, the product of running blindly through underbrush. Severe but treatable was his dehydration. Another matter entirely was his psychological state. For 3 days, Burke remained in a semi-conscious state, waking periodically to scream about things pursuing him, then collapsing into exhausted sleep. When he finally regained enough clarity to speak coherently, so disturbing was his testimony that Gresham initially refused to believe it. For days of systematic psychological dismantling were described by Burke. Of a girl who moved through the forest like smoke, who seemed to be in multiple places simultaneously, who demonstrated complete control over terrain that defeated 5 armed men, he spoke. Repeatedly, she had been close enough to touch them, that she had stolen from them while they watched, that the forest itself had somehow aligned with her against them, he insisted. She knew, Burke kept repeating. She knew everything. Where we'd step, where we'd look, what we'd do next. It was like she'd run this hunt 100 times before. Knew every mistake we'd make before we made it. About the other 4 overseers, when Gresham pressed him, blank went Burke's face, and at nothing, he stared for several minutes before answering. Nathaniel died of fever. William drowned. Jacob and Samuel. I don't know. I ran. When she gave us the choice, I ran. The next day, a search party was organized by Gresham. 10 men from neighboring plantations, none of them his own enslaved workers, all carrying rifles and supplied for a week in the forest. With detailed instructions about where the 5 overseers had been heading, with Burke's rough descriptions of landmarks he remembered, they entered the Bottomlands. Samuel Yarrow's body was found by them 3 days into the search, face down in a shallow creek 2 miles from the plantation boundary. The water was barely deep enough to cover his chest, but motionless, he lay in it, already showing signs of decomposition in the humid heat. No signs of violence, no wounds, no evidence of struggle were found by the coroner who examined the body. From exhaustion in water too shallow to pose a drowning threat to anyone with the strength to lift their head, Samuel had simply collapsed, and that strength remaining, he hadn't had. After finding Samuel, deeper into the bottomlands, the search party refused to go. That the terrain became increasingly difficult to navigate, that landmarks seemed to shift, that they had found symbols carved into trees in patterns they couldn't interpret, they reported. Constantly feeling watched, hearing sounds that didn't match any animal they recognized, finding their supplies rearranged when they made camp despite posting guards were reported by several men. After 5 days, the search was called off by Gresham. 3 men were still missing: Jacob Yarrow, William Tyson, and Nathaniel Cruz. But the value of recovery was outweighed by the risk of losing more people searching for bodies. As lost to swamp conditions, all 3 would be listed by the official county records, a vague phrase that avoided uncomfortable questions about how experienced overseers could be defeated by wilderness and a runaway girl. For another 2 weeks, Jacob Yarrow's fate remained unknown until hunters from a neighboring county reported finding remains in the deep bottomland 6 miles from where the search party had stopped. Too decomposed for positive identification was the body, but the clothing fragments and a distinctive pocket watch confirmed it was Jacob. After the clearing confrontation, he had apparently continued walking, perhaps trying to find his own way out. Perhaps simply refusing to follow his brother and Burke. Whatever his reasoning, deeper into the swamp instead of towards safety, he had walked, and him, the forest had claimed. William Tyson and Nathaniel Cruz were never found. In the swamp, their bodies presumably remained, consumed by scavengers and decay, absorbed into the ecosystem that had defeated them. Of erasing people completely, leaving no trace beyond the memories of those who had known them, the bottomlands had a way. For 2 more weeks after emerging from the forest, Henry Burke remained at the Gresham plantation, recovering physically while his psychological state deteriorated further. Poorly, he slept when he slept at all, jerking awake at sounds no one else heard, staring at shadows no one else saw. Near the eastern property line, he refused to go, wouldn't even look toward the tree line that marked where civilization ended and the bottomlands began. With expressions that mixed satisfaction with something deeper, validation perhaps that the power structure they suffered under was more fragile than it appeared, the enslaved workers at Gresham's plantation watched Burke's decline. For 2 years, Overseer Burke, who had wielded authority with casual cruelty, now jumped at bird calls and drew symbols in the dirt compulsively whenever he thought no one was watching. A source of whispered conversation among the enslaved population became those symbols. They were creek markings. From interactions with indigenous people before the removal, some people recognized them. Older than that, others insisted, symbols that predated European contact entirely, meanings lost even to the creeks themselves. Whatever their origin, constantly, Burke drew them, the same patterns he had seen on trees in the bottomlands, copying them with obsessive precision, as though trying to decode a message meant for someone else. When Burke finally left Wilkinson County, he told anyone who would listen that from the moment they entered the bottomlands, they had been hunted. Not attacked, he would clarify when people misunderstood, but hunted in a way that was somehow worse than violence. Studied, catalogued, guided into situations where their own weaknesses destroyed them. She never had to hurt us, Burke would say, his voice carrying an edge of awe mixed with terror. The forest hurt us. Our ignorance hurt us. She just watched, guided, made sure we encountered every danger we were too stupid to avoid on our own. As fever dreams, the confused memories of a man who had experienced genuine trauma and was processing it through exaggeration and fantasy, most people dismissed Burke's testimony. But those who had spent time in the bottomlands, who knew how treacherous that terrain could be, something different in his words heard, recognition that knowledge of environment could be weaponized, that someone who truly understood wilderness could manipulate it in ways that seemed impossible to outsiders. In Alabama, Burke eventually settled, taking work as a clerk in a general store, refusing all offers to return to overseer work. Another 33 years, he lived, dying in 1872. And throughout his life, he maintained that what happened in the Ojai bottomlands in October 1839 was the most terrifying experience a human being could endure. Not because of violence or monsters, but because it revealed how thoroughly helpless people could become when they ventured into environments they didn't understand, pursuing people who did. At the Gresham plantation, Celia was never seen again. With county authorities, Thomas Gresham filed a formal runaway report describing her age, appearance, and the circumstances of her flight, but no serious effort was made to recover her. When asked to organize a pursuit, the local sheriff pointed out that 5 overseers had failed to bring her back and 4 had died in the attempt. What exactly did Gresham expect a sheriff's deputy to accomplish? An answer that didn't sound absurd, Gresham couldn't articulate. How could he explain that not because of her labor value, he needed his runaway caught, but because letting her escape successfully would undermine his authority with the remaining enslaved workers? How could he admit that on people believing escape was impossible, his entire operation depended? And otherwise, one successful flight demonstrated. With expressions of quiet satisfaction that they were careful to hide from remaining white authority, the enslaved population at Gresham's plantation noted Celia's disappearance. Among themselves in the few moments when surveillance lapsed, they passed stories about what had happened in the forest. With each retelling, the details grew, acquiring mythological elements, but the core remained consistent. One of their number had faced the overseer's worst intentions and emerged victorious, had turned hunters into prey using nothing but knowledge her mother had passed down, knowledge that predated slavery and plantations and overseers entirely. To neighboring plantations through networks of communication that slaveholders didn't know existed or vastly underestimated, the stories spread. Within a month, some version of what had happened when 5 overseers pursued a Creek girl into the bottomlands was known by enslaved workers across Wilkinson County. The specifics varied. Some versions had Celia killing the overseers directly, others had the forest itself rising against them, a few suggested supernatural intervention. But the same essential message was carried by them all: resistance was possible, escape was achievable, and knowledge could overcome force. Rapidly after October 1839, Thomas Gresham's plantation declined. Though to outsiders, the connection to the Bottomlands incident wasn't immediately obvious, the pattern was recognized by his more astute neighbors: small acts of resistance from enslaved workers that compounded daily, subtle degradations of efficiency that added up to significant production losses, and most critically, an unwillingness among potential overseers to work for Gresham regardless of salary offered. Through overseer networks, word had spread about what happened to Yarrow and his crew. The specific details were disputed, but clear was the outcome: Gresham's plantation was where overseers went to die or go mad. About the Bottomlands, about runaway procedures, about what exactly had happened to the previous overseers, pointed questions were asked by the few men who inquired about positions. When Gresham's evasive answers were heard by them, employment was found elsewhere. Without overseers willing to enforce discipline through fear, the brutal efficiency that cotton production demanded couldn't be maintained by Gresham. In 1840, 20%, his yields dropped; in 1841, 30%. Overtly rebellious weren't his enslaved workers. They showed up for work, they performed their assigned tasks, but at their own pace, with their own standards, they did so, and anything more, Gresham had no mechanism to compel. Directly, he tried managing, taking on some overseer duties himself, but he was one man attempting to control 37 people who had learned they could resist in ways that were impossible to punish. Tools disappeared and reappeared. Lighter than they should be were cotton bales. Between field and weighing, the missing pounds were somehow lost. Constant repair were needed by fences. With suspicious frequency, equipment broke. By 1842, bankrupt was Gresham. At a devastating loss to a speculator from South Carolina, who had no knowledge of its history and wouldn't learn about the Bottomlands incident until after completing the purchase, the plantation was sold by him. Through renewed brutality, the new owner attempted to restore profitability, hiring overseers with fearsome reputations, but the same resistance Gresham had faced was encountered by them: not open rebellion, but passive defiance so consistent it was impossible to combat. Over the next 8 years, 3 more times, the plantation changed hands. That the land itself seemed cursed, that enslaved workers here were somehow different from those at neighboring operations, more resistant, less controllable, was discovered by each owner. To events in 1839, to a girl who demonstrated that authority could be overthrown through knowledge rather than violence, this resistance was connected by none of them. After the overseer deaths, their dangerous reputation was retained by the Ojai bottomlands, but in local storytelling, the nature of that danger evolved. Treacherous terrain anymore, it wasn't just. It was territory that had declared independence from the plantation system. Land where the normal rules didn't apply, where escaped people could disappear and white authority couldn't follow. Practical purposes were served by this mythology. Of runaways who fled east toward the swamps, it discouraged pursuit. Psychological barriers that were more effective than physical ones were created by it, making the bottomland seem so dangerous that sending search parties appeared futile. And most importantly, that certain areas existed outside the control of the system that defined the antebellum South, spaces where different rules applied, it suggested. Actually, in the bottomlands, Celia remained or traveled farther was impossible to confirm, but for decades, reports persisted of travelers being guided through the swamps by a woman who appeared from the forest, led them to safety, then vanished without giving her name. Across time, these accounts were remarkably consistent. The guide was always described as mixed Creek and African heritage, always demonstrating extraordinary knowledge of the terrain, always refusing payment or thanks, always disappearing before questions could be asked. As folktales, the kind of mythology that grows around wilderness areas where actual disappearances occurred, these reports are generally dismissed by historians. That across decades, the descriptions remained too consistent, suggesting a shared cultural narrative rather than independent observations of a real person who would have aged visibly over that time span, they point out. But a different story is told by oral histories preserved by Creek and African communities. As hosting a small population of escaped people who had created a semi-permanent settlement in the deep swamps, living off the land using techniques passed down from indigenous ancestors, occasionally helping other runaways reach safety farther north, they described the bottomlands. Specifically as one of the settlement's founders, someone who used her experience evading overseers to establish pathways and protocols for others, these accounts name Celia. Ultimately unprovable is whether these oral histories document facts or wishful thinking. Though the bottomland's hostile preservation conditions would destroy most structures within years, no physical evidence of such a settlement has been found. Though slaveholders had strong incentives to suppress such information if they knew about it, no written records from the period mention organized runaway communities in the Ojai swamps. What is documented, verifiable in multiple sources, is that between 1840 and 1860, an unusually high rate of successful escapes was experienced by the Wilkinson County region. With far greater frequency than those farther west, enslaved people from plantations bordering the bottomlands disappeared, and far fewer runaways than in comparable Georgia counties were recovered by pursuit efforts. Something about that area made escape more viable, whether it was simply the terrain itself or the presence of people who had mastered living within it. Incomplete remain the court records from October 1839, many pages mysteriously missing from the county archives. What survives is fragmentary testimony from Henry Burke, depositions taken while he was still recovering, describing events that the court clerk noted seemed impossible to credit, yet delivered with such conviction as to suggest genuine belief in their accuracy. A picture of systematic psychological warfare was painted by Burke's descriptions: a girl who moved through the forest with preternatural skill, who seemed to anticipate every action the overseers took, who demonstrated complete mastery over terrain that killed them. Building weapons from natural materials, navigating in absolute darkness, approaching them repeatedly without detection, and ultimately offering mercy they didn't deserve, he described. After reviewing Burke's testimony and examining Samuel and Jacob Yarrow's remains, by natural causes exacerbated by poor judgment, all deaths resulted, concluded the court. Specifically stated the verdict: the deceased entered hostile terrain without adequate preparation, pursued a quarry who possessed superior knowledge of said terrain, and subsequently perished through exposure, exhaustion, and environmental hazards. No evidence suggests deliberate violence. The runaway Negro girl, Celia, is charged with flight, but cannot be held responsible for deaths that resulted from the pursuer's inadequate skills. For its time, remarkable was this verdict: acknowledging that enslaved people could possess knowledge superior to their captors, and that pursuing them without respect for that knowledge carried fatal consequences. That the verdict reflected the court's discomfort with the implications of ruling differently, with admitting that a teenage girl had defeated 5 armed overseers through strategic superiority rather than luck, is suggested by some historians. Throughout Georgia, by the enslaved population, the symbolism of the verdict wasn't lost. That knowledge could overcome force, that understanding terrain mattered more than weapons, legal acknowledgement spread through communication networks and became part of the broader resistance culture. Other narratives of successful resistance were joined by the story of Celia and the Bottomlands, teaching lessons about how to survive, how to fight back, how to win on terms the oppressor system didn't understand. In Texas, where he had relocated after selling his Georgia plantation, Thomas Gresham died in 1851. Cotton operations in the new territory he had attempted to restart, but similar problems were encountered: workers who resisted subtly, overseers who quit without explanation, yields that never matched expectations. Of his Georgia plantation or the events of October 1839, no mention was made by his obituary in the Houston newspaper, describing him as a farmer of moderate success whose ambitions exceeded his luck. In Alabama, as mentioned, Henry Burke died in 1872, having lived 33 years after emerging from the Bottomlands. His service as a store clerk and his reputation for peculiar views regarding wilderness areas and their dangers were noted by his obituary. That he had never spoken of his overseer years except to warn them against pursuing work that required entering unfamiliar forests, and that he had kept drawings hidden in his personal effects, symbols he had copied from trees in Georgia decades earlier, preserved as though they held meaning he had spent his life trying to decode, was reported by family members. The ultimate question, what truly happened in the Ohio Bottomlands in October 1839, remained subject to interpretation. Straightforward is the physical evidence: 5 men entered, 4 died from environmental causes, 1 emerged psychologically shattered. Never recovered was the girl they pursued. No violence was proven, no supernatural occurrence documented. But profound and lasting were the psychological and social impacts. That knowledge of environment could be weaponized effectively was demonstrated by the incident. That pursuit didn't guarantee capture, that people dismissed as powerless could defeat those presumed superior through strategic thinking and terrain mastery. These lessons rippled outward, influencing how enslaved people thought about resistance, how slaveholders thought about control, and how Southern society understood the supposed inevitability of its power structure. Far beyond Wilkinson County, the story spread, carried by enslaved people sold to other regions, by overseers who heard cautionary tales from colleagues, by travelers who had heard locals discuss the mysterious Bottomlands. In each retelling, the specific details shifted, but the core remained: the girl pursued by 5 armed men had survived, and her pursuers hadn't. And that inversion of expected outcomes revealed possibilities that the plantation system depended on people not recognizing. As an example of how individual acts of survival became collective mythology, how specific events transformed into broader lessons about power and knowledge, the Celia incident is often cited by modern historians studying antebellum resistance culture. Whether every detail of the story as preserved in oral histories is factual matters less than what the story accomplished, demonstrating that resistance was possible, that oppressors could be defeated, that knowledge passed down from ancestors could be more powerful than any weapon. Long after 1839, dangerous territory remained the Bottomlands themselves, claiming other lives over the decades, but they also remained a symbol of places beyond the plantation system's control, of knowledge that couldn't be stolen or destroyed, of resistance that didn't require violence but could be just as effective. And sometimes even today, people hiking through what remains of the Ohio Bottomlands report feeling watched, hearing sounds that don't match any known animal, finding symbols carved into old growth trees that look too deliberate to be natural damage. Are these residual traces of historical events, or simply the mind's tendency to find patterns and meaning in wilderness spaces? The answer probably depends on whether you believe knowledge of forest and survival skills passed through generations can leave impressions on a landscape itself, or whether you think all such phenomena are just stories we tell ourselves about places where remarkable things happened long ago. What do you think happened in those Georgia Bottomlands? Do you believe it was simply environmental hazards and superior knowledge of terrain? Or was there something more profound in how the forest claimed for overseers? Do you think Celia survived in the wilderness? Or did she perhaps help establish communities of escaped people living beyond the plantation system's reach? Leave your comments below and share your theories. If you found this historical account compelling, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this, dark tales from America's past where the official records tell one story, but the deeper truth reveals something far more complex. Share this video with someone who appreciates narratives of survival against impossible odds. And check out our other videos exploring forgotten histories that challenge our assumptions about power, resistance, and how people survive systems designed to destroy them. Many secrets are kept by the forest, and together, we'll continue uncovering them. Deliberately, some stories get buried because the truths they contain are too uncomfortable for those who benefit from official narratives. But these stories persist, passed down through generations, preserved in fragments of documents and oral traditions, waiting for people willing to examine what really happened, when knowledge confronted force, when terrain became weapon, when the hunted became something far more dangerous than hunters ever imagined. See you in the next video.